Hello. We are here for another episode of The Music Prophet today's kind of exciting. We started off the show back in June with a mix of local legends. We had Sean Barrett and Jen Holub and Sean Cosmo, people who have been really integral in the music community over the years. And I'm excited because today we have another one of those people who've been around to see a lot of things come and go and who's still helping younger musicians really get their start. So welcome, Billy Bruhmuller, to the show.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for doing this show. It's a really awesome thing you're doing.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been great to be able to have musicians come in the studio and just talk about music,
Yeah. That's one of the things I love about keeping a foot in this game is just sharing all the wonderful world of music and how it makes you feel.
I'm really curious with you how it's changed over the years, considering how much you've done,
Well, I might have a biased perspective because I come from the world of the 90s where it seemed like there was a kind of like a faster pace to it. Everything was analog, and that kind of forced everything to kind of go fast and get it done. But there was probably what felt like a kind of almost self-contained kind of music economy where people do shows and there'd be all kinds of halls kind of with shows almost every weekend, and it seemed like the townhouse was band nights 7 nights a week. But that would translate into a lot of recordings, and I just kind of think that throughput just really became just like one center focus of my life for felt like decades. I think in the changes these days, you have, which is an awesome thing, the home recording. It's much more accessible to people, and if you have, I find there's a whole personal development aspect to home recording because it can be pretty challenging. So you really have to. There's a lot of discipline and sort of plowing through the learning curve. But I guess in the big shift would be from like analog to digital, which digital has a lot of benefits, and I'm still a fan of a lot of the aspects of analog. But they both have their own frustrations. But something I kind of look back fondly on the time of analog as well.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of what the Foo Fighters put out a documentary at one point when they went through 8 analog studios in 8 different cities to try to capture the essence of rock music during the 90s and late 80s. And but it also covered a lot of the analog time period when they would have to cut the strips and glue them back into place to make sure that sound would fit, or with certain takes.
Right, yeah, very minimal editing compared to these days, where there's kind of like the classic sort of digital recording joke at the time when it was transitioning, was being in the control room and sort of pressing the talk back mic and saying, "That was horrible, come on in." It's like the idea being that we're going to fix it all in here.
But has that changed the way? Has it changed the way that you record?
I think so. I think there was a sense before that you really had to have everything together. You, I think, had more sort of pre-production, whereas these days you can kind of go in with something sort of semi-formed, and of course the danger of that is now you've got such limitless options. Before you'd have 16 tracks, and it's like, we're going to put, all right, these would be drums, we got 2 guitar tracks, we can put a tambourine on the solo track, and then sort of map it all out, and so you'd have a map of it, and when that was filled in, it was done. But nowadays, it's kind of like, all right, well, we got 47 vocal tracks, should we do a few more, just and then you kind of root through this stuff at the end, and I think recordings tend to capture, as cliche as it sounds, like the vibe of what was happening during the recording. And if that if that vibe is full of excitement, the studio's full of excitement, things are moving. When you start getting, everyone's just like lamenting, sort of having to deal with stuff, and then when you listen to the recording afterwards, sometimes I feel that that's kind of detected. I kind of look back on the recordings and and right at that moment when you hit play, there's either like this sort of spark that intrigues you, or sometimes it's like, well, it sounds good, but it's not really that interesting. I don't know if I'm going to listen to it again for a while.
Right, because once you hit take 47 of the same vocal chorus, it's not really, there's no excitement anymore. It's just robotic almost.
Yeah, although, some people kind of have that workflow and it works for them because I guess from a certain sense, it might be part of the development. You might have something that you're actually, developing a vocal characteristic in the studio, whereas, I think beforehand in the days before that option, you might have to, the band would have to sound pretty much how you'd want the record to sound in the end, live kind of thing, or very close to it.
Right, because you can't go back. You can't really, you don't have the budget nor the time to really just experiment as much in the studio.
Yeah, no, and that was the thing with the old days too. It's like you kind of did it, moved on. Nowadays, and that's one of the big benefits of digital is you have this sort of total recall situation. It's like, all right, we've sort of worked on it. We're gonna open up the session 2 weeks from now. Do a few more tweaks and stuff. Whereas 2 weeks later in the old days, bands would be working on their next record because you can't just if you go back to the studio, it's going to take a whole day to set up all of the outboard gear and the mixing board to even try to be close to how it sounded 2 weeks ago. It's, so that was kind of an ordeal that one of the things that made it a lot more stressful back in those days too, because if you had a band, we're almost finished with something over a weekend, but Monday morning there's something else coming in and the whole board and everything's going to be reset, and it's like, oh, you just got 2 more songs to mix, and everybody would be sort of stretched out with arms across the board and going till the wee hours just because it's like, if we don't get it done tonight, it's going to be a big ordeal to set it up again.
To get back the settings and that'd be, I can't even imagine, especially as a sound tech at that point, like that'd just be horrendous knowing that you have one song left on a 12-track album and you have to come back for one afternoon, reset the entire board just for 3.5 minutes. Yeah.
But, life is like that. That's what sometimes there's unrealistic, and I think you can really burn yourself out if you just kind of like, keep an unrealistic sense of, expectations and try to live. Not that I always did that, but it is and there's a sense of guilt if you don't, right? So,
can you take us through what a producer does? Because I mean, a lot of the listeners are musicians already, but for anyone that's not, I feel like there's that barrier of what you see a producer doing versus what they're actually doing. There's that gap.
Yeah, and that's I've been trying to answer that question for a long time now, and it seems like there's a pretty wide range of producers, and some of them just have a really good sense of, imagine what that next project's going to sound like for the band. And then they kind of almost, put all the pieces together that's going to create that. And whenever something doesn't fit that, they fix it. So they're not, and then there's some that are just completely hands-on. And I think that's probably more the trend these days, where, they'll have certain understandings of recorded sound and they'll know certain things that work and won't work, and they'll have they're ultimately they're where the buck stops, the bottom line for the band. So if it lands in their lap, if something's not working, everybody's looking to the producer to fix it.
Because they're controlling the sound, the output, all the levels. It's
well, in the case of I think of what's that big gruff guy with the beard, big famous producer,
Rick Rubin.
Rubin, yeah. So I kind of follow his engineer, on YouTube and stuff. So he's kind of like the main guy that he seems to work with. But it seems that Rick's kind of style is a little bit more of a taking the work in progress, and from what I remember kind of reading about, just putting some headphones on and lying back on the studio couch and listening, and then kind of yay or naying and saying, this didn't like this verse. So he's not really too involved in the recording. I shouldn't say I really don't know, but that was the impression that I got, that he was just a much more the abstract picture, while his engineer was the guy that sort of decided the mics. And
right. So can we jump into that a bit more, actually, of the relationship between the engineer and the producer then? Because there would be that balance of maybe you control a lot of the mics as the producer and you're controlling where the sound goes. But in other situations like Rick Rubin, he would just be saying, this was great, but there's parts that were just, can we turn down this and touch something else up, right?
Yeah. So he'd kind of have the last say on the final balances of the mix, and I think they tend to work together quite a bit, the engineer and producer, and there's quite a bit of overlap. There's the most recent story that I read, or no, it wasn't a story. I think it was one of, wish I could remember his names, but his YouTube videos. And he's talking about, let's touch it back to the analog digital, why he's mixing in the box these days, meaning the computer as opposed to on the big recording console. And he showed some mixes to Rick, and Rick said, what time did you mix these? It's like, I don't know, it's like 3 in the afternoon or something. And Rick says, well, don't mix that time. The grid's kind of crappy. The electricity's not so good. The rails aren't getting the voltage they need to sound good. So he's like, well, yeah, all right, I'm out of this analog world. I want a computer where it's going to sound the same every time.
That's hilarious how time made a difference.
Yeah. No, and it's true. I got myself just like a little, sort of like a power bar with one of those little voltage meters, and kind of hovers between 115 and 120. But I'd notice I would get more as it drops closer to 115. It seems like there'd be more buzzes and hums in the sound than when it's up to 120. So
that's interesting.
It's something I wasn't really fully aware of as much as I am now until the past year or so. But I would notice even playing in different venues when you plug in your amp, and it just seemed, I kind of blamed a lot on the room at the time, but you're like, man, with this amp, it feels so plinky today. It's like, normally I would have tons of gain and the note would kind of sing forever. It's like, This is one of those weird phenomena that may explain it.
Maybe, right? Because I suppose the sound that's coming through, it's if there isn't the voltage that's able to carry it as much as you hope.
Yeah, no, I think we kind of take these things for granted. So my buddy was having problems with his console as well, where he just kind of do these weird crashes, and it's like, I wonder if that's the voltage thing, because that tends to sort of computer-based electronics when it doesn't get enough. So the more I'm looking into that.
How much time do you spend researching audio technique and sound technique and even the technical side of things?
That's a good question. It is definitely my hobby as well. So I think everybody has their thing that they love to look into and find all the look through a microscope and there's some sort of, some sort of abstract metaphor to life in this thing for them. So sound is my thing. So I'd probably say,
A
on
lot.
average, a good few hours a day if you even it all out, probably.
And do you find that you have, like, is there certain websites that you go to, or is it a lot of YouTube searching?
Yeah, it's probably mostly YouTube. Far and away YouTube. There's a couple other sites. There's a really good, used to be called lynda.com. It's kind of more of a teaching, for schools and stuff like that. But they have like it's a lot of, you can sort of find a lot of similar stuff on YouTube, but this was kind of nicely packaged and, with that. Can't knock YouTube.
Yeah, there's a lot. And even with lynda.com or Udemy, there's a lot of websites like that too, where it's great courses.
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of information out there that anybody these days that want to take something and run with it, they can. There's one guy. I forget the YouTube channel, but I just watched this interview with him, and he just jumped into the recording game. He's been doing it for about a year, and he just kind of big fan of music, loved these metal bands, and he basically, I don't think it was so much through YouTube. I think that was a part of it, but like within a year, he was recording some of his favorite bands that had some pretty high profiles, just for the fact that he was so into it, and he would his method was he would do some recording, and then as he was mixing, he'd sort of play it back, and 3 seconds in, if something didn't sound right to him, he would just keep working on it till he could get like 4 seconds in, until 5 seconds in, until everything sort of sounded right to him. Which I gotta say, I really like that idea, and that's one of the sort of ideas that I try to focus on. That seems to be a separation between, say, maybe engineers and producers, is that kind of vision where if you know what you're looking for and you have something in your mind's eye that you're trying to achieve, you can just kind of keep refining it and shaping it towards that. Where I've been in that state before, where you just kind of, it's a guitar amp. I don't know. I'll put a 57 on that because that's kind of the thing you do. You kind of do the things that you're supposed to do, and then you hit the record button. And I find, people who, even myself, when I've had it's like, no, I got to have a vision for this. And I sort of, one thing I used to do too a lot with clients is get them to bring in sort of like some reference materials. Like imagine your dream billing at a show. What are the 3 other bands you're going to be playing with?
Right. What does it sound like?
And try to get a sense, at least get their vision of what a great drum sound is. And there's a lot of similar characteristics.
You've worked with a lot of different artists in a lot of different genres. You mentioned that you can't believe that you did it, but do you surprise yourself sometimes?
Yeah, totally. Actually, so much comes like flooding back when I kind of hear that. It's like I almost remember the sound in that room. Like that studio had a particularly good drum room. It's like, oh, the drums had this nice big sort of pow to them. And but the thing about this one is that I remember it being like pretty fast. Like they were like a live band. They sort of set up, and I don't remember a whole lot of finessing about the sound. It's kind of like, I think there's probably the first thing I'd recorded with these guys. I had a general idea of sort of like what they would sound like, but yeah, it just seems like what kind of came out when I listen to it now. It's like, oh my God, it's hard to believe that I was part of this. It's just so awesome.
Are there certain artists that you've worked with that, they are like that, but are there other names or bands that you've worked with that you still can't believe that you had that opportunity?
Yeah, like I said, I was kind of going through last night looking for some stuff to play, and it was kind of it was very difficult because I felt that way about so much of the stuff. So yeah, it was really hard to pick just 2 songs, but yeah, it's really nice, like working with all these people, and and they, and again, I'm, kind of like in the studio, I don't have a lot of forceful opinions. I don't think I kind of tend to like, let's hook up everything, see what happens, and then start, kind of refining from there. And had my 2 cents, but yeah, I found most of the people that I work with, they would sort of have like a pretty good idea when they come in, and they'd want to try something, and I'm pretty into trying different stuff, and what would come across or come out of it was something that I'd take like a little mental note of, like try to build these little mental tips and tricks book in the back of my mind that I seem to have forgotten so much by now, but.
And I imagine it would change too, because you've done work with Mickey O'Brien,
yeah,
and Joey Karma, but at the same time, you've worked with people like Cassie Tires. So like, I'm just fascinated by that contrast of the tips and tricks that were used with rap, and then the tricks that you use with like Christian folk. It's such a mix.
Yeah. I think it probably has quite a bit more overlap than people, tend to think. But that's always the danger of getting too much of a template of how you want to record stuff. It's like, I know what my snare is going to use this, and this, and and so I try to keep myself, that balance with a bit of an open slate too, so that I'm not, when there's new ideas that come across the plate, that I'm open to trying them. So.
Yeah, and what are some of those tricks that you'd picked up over the years that seem to fit for both?
Well, one of the things these days, and I, and a lot of my students, I tend to go quite heavy on distortion plugins, or a lot of times there's amp simulators that go on a lot of certain tracks, and I think this is probably related to my sort of pining for analog days, but this sort of saturation tends to create a little bit more of that analog feel and stuff, where digital in certain cases can get, I guess, a bit of a sterile, or by nature of it, the whole industry has been working to remove harmonic distortion out of the gear, so that when they measure a signal going in, the signal coming out kind of looks the same. But that was not in the case. A lot of this classic gear that's kind of sought after these days, there's all kinds of funny, weird, quirky characteristics going on that, and a big part of that was this sort of saturation, or harmonic overtones, I guess they would call it.
Because really, in the end, especially when you look at a lot of the modern recording style, it is very clean and precise, and it almost sounds flawless.
Yeah, and I find it's, it might be a good analogy is like when they came out with high definition televisions. You get a lot of newscasters sort of complaining that all the wrinkles are showing and blemishes, and and when that stuff is super clear, it can kind of be distracting from the message. In the case of the music, I would, I remember my brother had this great old speaker, an old stereo system, and it's all very warm and fuzzy. You mostly just made out the melody and the rhythm. A lot of the details, the subtle details, were much more subtle. And then I'd hear the same songs on my dad's system, who had very sort of top of the line, super crisp, clear speakers. and it was still stunningly, like, it was still pretty awesome. But I noticed the way I listened to it was different. I got in a little bit more of a hypnotic sort of zone connection to the music with my brother's stereo. My dad had all this sort of distraction every time, like, the ride cymbal, this ding, ding, ding would sort of catch my attention. Everything was sort of jumping out at me. It was like the whole idea of the song, which was, it was just kind of getting a little bit subdued by all these flashy details.
That's interesting because that is, with certain genres, that it's a trend. And I mean, in rap music, it's a thing where you use a lot of very subtle synth tones
right.
to fill those gaps, and then you layer the tones on top of each other. And so that's actually a really good point, because when you listen to a lot of music, it's really common.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
So does that change how you record? Like if a musician asks, if they ask for a lot of tiny little details and flashy things, are you still okay with adding that?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And not to take away that I am a fan of, like, this sort of subtle changes to the music. I find that's a big part of production too, where you finesse the listener. It's like, to kind of stick with that analogy, it's like, MTV videos had to be cut every 6 seconds because you got to keep the viewer. So I noticed that just like a little subtle change in the mix, that if you just bring up something just a touch, after the first 4 bars for the next 4 bars, it just felt like there's a little bit more. So when people sort of build the layers like that, it doesn't. And I think that's probably the trick, where it's like, in some cases, if it jumps out, it's too distracting. If it's a subtle layer thing, then you're just actually kind of drawing, as long as it's keeping the listener sort of attuned to the right things.
I'm curious how much your background of playing guitar has made you really tuned to that too.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine being an engineer without being a musician, because I think you really notice things, and even when I'm in the recording process, I kind of have to, like, air drum and air guitar, all the stuff that's going on, like, to feel if a drum track is working. You get that sense, can I sort of rock out to it?
Yeah, you have to test it out first.
Does it feel like something's missing, or So, but and I would just kind of tinkering around at home. That's where I really get because I know exactly the characteristics I like and I don't like. And, even if I'm sort of like working with somebody else and their guitar sound, I might not be totally tuned in to, and then they start describing something that they don't like about it. And, I'd have to really get into the guitar mindset and almost try it out and get that feeling, like, oh yeah, I see what the issue is here. But in the case where you're not coming from that musician perspective, you might not appreciate how the need for a fulfilling sound in your headphones kind of thing.
And being able to replicate the riffs that the artist is trying to pull off, or being able to play it and adding an element to it and saying, hey, what about this instead? That's kind of huge to making things become hands-on.
Yeah. And sometimes that's where it kind of crosses over to the engineer producer, where it's like, oh, that's that riff you're doing is, sonically it's really hard to get that low, and you want something really punchy, and that's the idea of that part. Like, maybe we can try another layer to that, an octave up, so that, because those frequencies will make a speaker pop. Those ones, they're going to get bogged down. They're going to muddy up so there's that kind of aspect to it.
Do you still play as much, or do you find that the more that you get busy recording, the less time you have to actually enjoy music as it is?
Yeah, they're pretty intertwined for me, so I probably play just as much as I ever did. Yeah, it's pretty different style. It's I seem to be doing really long phases of things. So right now it's kind of just I'm into the really soft touch fingertip kind of thing. And, it's one of the things. I'm a huge Stones fan all my life, and I was like really enamored by Keith Richards' sound. He had all these really big, thick sounding chords, and one of the kind of realizations that I came to is like, well, he's got a really soft touch, and that's one of the ironic things in recording is that a lot of times a soft touch makes the bigger sound, and it's almost like and with drums, sometimes that's the case. Like if sometimes the loudest sort of recorded snare sound that you can get, especially with digital, you have an absolute zero that you can't really go above.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, you hit it really hard, you'll have a really sharp transient that hits that, but it's almost an undetectable. The transient happens so fast, hits that zero. The rest of the snare sound stays down kind of low. And if it's tapped and the transient's not that big of a spike, then you can just imagine the rest of the sound kind of float it right up to that zero. And the volume wars aren't as big as they were in the 90s with CDs, and everybody had to try and get something, but it's still there. You don't want your song on an iTunes playlist to feel weaker and quieter than the one previous, right?
Right. And I like that you mentioned about the sound spike, because especially when it comes to audio editing, you max out. Your sound is quite literally limited. Where it hits a certain point, it just cuts off. So anything that's high frequency.
That's right. Yeah, it's got that big chop that spike out. Now you can float the rest of that sound right up to the zero, and now it's screaming loud compared to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of the concept of. I'm sure there's other aspects to it, but.
So does that change for you? Do you go from soft touch to going to like maybe Paul McCartney style, or the Mick Jagger approach to playing? Do you change up?
Well, the thing that's weird and kind of ironic about it is, if you have the drums that are like, it's got to sound rocking like someone's bashing the hell out of it, because that's what you emote and that's what you want to get across, and that's where a lot of audio tools come in, like compressors, to try and, you can do a lot of that stuff in the processing, but I find, experimenting somewhere in between, there's an element of, almost sort of creating that effect where you're not actually, say, playing as hard, but you want to create the illusion, or almost create that sense that you are. But this is probably far off into the weeds of things. And that's kind of my thought du jour, de NA of the year. I'm just kind of working on that principle. Just demystifying sound is that's the name of the game for me.
With the bands you've talked about today, and also just even from the time that I've known you, it's interesting how a lot of them have gone to certain places, and whether it's been luck or just you happen to know the right people. A lot of theirs worked with have moved on to bigger cities, or have gone on to be signed or do tours. So how has that impacted your view on the studio, and has it made you more humble, or is it more of just cool, this happened, let's move forward?
Yeah, I think probably more the latter, but it sort of brings up the sort of sense, and I've heard a few people say, oh man, Sudbury feels like it's got this dome, it's like it's a really sort of self and contained, and so there's always that sort of like extra, feels like a drive to sort of break out of it. And I don't know, I think a lot of that was a pretty exciting era, like 2004. We were just sort of talking about that on the break, how we had Far From Heroes started dealing with Sony, and it felt like we were just starting to, make these connections to the bigger centers, which, and again, from a production standpoint, you kind of really feel like you're a bit on an island here. In the bigger centers, everyone's got a couple degrees of separation to somebody who's very prominent, so at least you have a sense that, the way you're doing things is okay because that's the way, Joe's uncle who works at this big studio does it and stuff. But here we're just very, kind of feels like it's sort of flying blind, and and then stuff starts happening, and it's there's probably an extra sense of pride to it because of that.
Yeah, there's definitely the element too that there's artists who are just starting out, and then there's ones who are accomplished, and they're all still playing the same bars even.
Yeah, no, and that's a weird phenomenon that seems to happen. Even when you read about stories about some of your idols and stuff, they always have that story about the person in their hometown who, was the one everybody thought was going to go on, and they sort of stayed at a certain place, and that's, I guess, that's one of the dangers of maybe getting too far too fast, maybe losing your humility. There's probably good to recognize that and try and stay humble.
Yeah, and even, who knows, maybe the cards just didn't play out right, or...
Totally, yeah. And
then yet, also, too, when you look at the band that Pistol George Warren, when you look at bands like that, where it's just, they just got busy and things just didn't work, and then...
Yeah, that was a shame. I was so blown away every time I saw them.
Mm-hmm.
Immaculate, because everything was like so awesome with those guys.
So I guess that's, and have you noticed, is that a trend in Sudbury that it's once bands start they fall off, or does it just come down to a lot of luck and who finds you? And
again, I think it feels like we're not Toronto's Shelbyville, but it's like when you're in Toronto and there's a connection, there's a network, and everybody sort of goes through that system first. And when you have this sort of like smaller towns, again, I think the internet's kind of democratized that quite a bit.
It's definitely changed it a ton at this point.
Yeah. So I mean, there's kind of a few challenges that way with Sudbury, but Sudbury's got a lot of pretty amazing things about it too. Having the townhouse all these years, that's, in my mind, that's one of Canada's premier venues. Like,
well, considering the lineup, right?
Yeah. No, it's been a real forum and developing ground for bands too. So.
Yeah, and it's especially in cities like this, it's massive because there's some artists who do leave the city, and if they didn't have the townhouse, or if you're in the metal hard rock genre, the Asylum, those stages are kind of where you learn. Right?
Yeah, it's so nice to have those. I really try and support those as much as I can, and I'm sweating a little bit because I feel guilty just talking about it. It's like, it's the problem with so much the comforts of entertainment available at home these days.
Yeah, the internet can remove that ability to actually go and support because it's all online,
Yeah.
A lot of it.
Yeah. We're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't. So.
But as a final sort of thing to wrap up, has the internet changed, or has it played a role in the way that you find bands to work with, or the way that they find you?
I imagine it would be. My plate's been sort of lightening up in that department over the years. So it's probably hasn't affected me as much, but I imagine again it's I think that word sort of democratizing of even all the elements of the music industry is probably fair to say. So as much as it can be knocked, the internet is a pretty awesome thing.
Yeah, and I think that is a good way to wrap it up. So thanks for coming on and sharing a couple of the artists that you've worked with. But it was nice. It was a good chat, and I think that.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was
awesome.
good.
Keep up the good work.
That's it for The Music Prophet. Thanks for listening, and you can find the other episodes on Spotify under The Music Prophet podcast, and we will see you next week.